All our online meetings are free and open to the public, though you must be registered in order to get the sign-on link. You'll find us online at 7 p.m. on the second Sunday of every month, but please note that we will take a programming break in December and we'll resume our regular schedule programs after the holidays in January. So look for us on the second Sunday evening of January. In a moment, we will hear from our featured speaker this evening, author John Hildebrand, who will take us along on an 800-mile canoe trip on 7 rivers through the forests and communities of northern Wisconsin. Now, first, we have a couple of announcements before we get to John's presentation. As Doug said, we are recording this so that you can watch it in the future. Please make sure you are muted, especially if you have a barking dog, a television, or other commotion in the background. Also, feel free to ask any questions of John while he is speaking by using the chat room at the bottom of your screen. We will select questions afterward and put them to the speaker. Now let's move along to our featured presentation for this evening. We're really so fortunate to welcome John Hildebrand to our Sierra Club meetings, speaker series meetings. John will be sharing adventures he chronicled in his latest book, Long Way Round Through the Heartland by River, published by the University of Wisconsin Press. John will speak about experiences that he had and the people he met on his paddle from the mighty Mississippi to the shimmering Bois Brule in northern Wisconsin, and much more. His travelogue by canoe is just what we need to keep us warm over the coming winter. Long before asphalt or even cobblestone, rivers were the original blue highways of America, connecting city and countryside and everywhere in between. They were the open road where travelers could expect to meet anyone and where all kinds of possibility lay around the next bend of the river. So when John set out to rediscover his home state of Wisconsin, a place torn by deep cultural and political divisions, he chose to go by canoe. Inspired by tales of a mythic round river, a circular stream where what goes around comes around, John found a land in the midst of an identity crisis, torn by new political divisions and the old gulf between city and countryside. Cobbling rivers together, he navigated the beautiful but complicated territory of home. In once prosperous small towns, he discovered unsung heroes, lockmasters, river rats, hotel keepers, mechanics, environmentalists, tribal leaders, and perennial mayors, all struggling to keep their communities afloat. While history doesn't flow in a circle, it doesn't necessarily flow in a straight line either. John charts in his book the improbable oxbows along its course. Long Way Round shows us the open road as a river with possibility around the next bend. John is the author of numerous books, including the award-winning Mapping the Farm, The Chronicle of a Family, and more recently, The Heart of Things, a Midwestern almanac. His essays have appeared in numerous publications, including Harper's, Audubon, and Sports Illustrated. His day job is teaching at the University of Wisconsin in Eau Claire. As an aside, John, we should mention that one of our recent speakers told us that she was a student of yours in college. So indeed, what goes around comes around.
Very nicely put.
This presentation is another in a series of popular online programs that we offer. Remember, it's free, it's open to the public, though registration is required. John, welcome to our Sunday Speaker Series. The microphone is all yours.
Well, thank you very much, Thomas. I appreciate the very kind words. I also appreciate the work the Sierra Club does in protecting our landscapes and our rivers. I'm very cognizant of the fact that they need protecting. So thanks to you and all your members. So the name of my presentation and the name of my book is Long Way Round. That was not my first choice for a title. I wanted to call it On the Round River. And my editor said, well, you can't do that because people will think there's a real round river. And I said, no, I think they'll realize that I'm, speaking metaphorically. And then I tried it out on a few people and they said, yeah, where is the Round River? Is it in the northern, eastern part of the state? So I took her point. But, the idea of a round river to me is very intriguing. And it begins with, I can get into the next slide. It begins with this guy, Paul Bunyan. He looks very much like he's standing outside of Fargo, North Dakota. So there was the first published Paul Bunyan tall tale was about Paul taking his logs to the sawmill when the ice broke up on the river. So he piled all the logs from his logging camp into the river and then jumped on a log raft and headed to the sawmill to get paid. And he's traveling a full day and comes around the bend and he sees another logging camp, but there's nobody there. And he thinks, oh my God, they're ahead of me. They're going to get to the sawmill before I do. So he keeps going. He pushes on. The next day, he sees another logging camp, which looks suspiciously like his own, and doesn't make the connection. And the third day, as he's coming around the bend again, he recognizes his red long johns flying from the flagpole, and he realizes he's been traveling on the Round River. That's all there is to the story. It's one of those, jokes that come in an order of three. But what I like about the story, I teach English, and I'm always looking for themes, and maybe the possible theme of that tall tale is you have to know where you've been in order to know where you're going. And I think history doesn't necessarily repeat itself, but there's a lot of similarities between what's going on now and what's transpired before. Anyway, in the 1930s, Aldo Leopold, the environmentalist, wrote an essay called The Round River. And I remember as a college student being very excited when that essay was assigned to me because, I like canoeing. I couldn't wait to read about this river. And anyway, in Leopold's essay, the river dries up about page 2, and he's not writing about rivers at all. He's writing about the flow of energy from the soil to plants to animals and to humans. So for him, the Round River was a convenient metaphor for talking about the biotic community, that the idea that we're all living things are connected. And I thought, that might be a good start for writing about my state, where things lately have not seemed connected, where there seem to be a lot of divisions. And I have lived in Wisconsin for 40 years, and yet sometimes I didn't recognize the place. So I thought I needed to take a roundabout trip, and I thought a river trip would be the perfect way to meet people, sort of take the pulse of the state. So I started devising my own version of the Round River that would take me away from home and then bring me back again. And I did it by linking together 7 different rivers. Now, I live in Eau Claire, which is on the Chippewa River. And I thought, well, all I have to do is launch my canoe about 2 blocks from home, go down the Chippewa River, and then I'll take a left at the Mississippi River, and I'll go down the Mississippi, and then I'll take another left at Prairie du Chien, and I'll go up the Wisconsin River. I did make a little side trip to the Leopold Shack, which is just south of Wisconsin Dells. Then I had a friend give me a car portage over to the aptly named town of Portage, where I got onto the Fox River, and I rode the Fox River down to Oshkosh. Now the Fox goes all the way, to Green Bay, but I was trying to avoid as much as possible dams, hydroelectric dams, and industrial areas, and the lower Fox has plenty of those. So instead, I made a great leap on another car portage to the Bad River, and I wanted to visit 2 communities, Mellon and Odana. One is a small white town, and the other is a Chippewa Indian town. And one is close by the headwaters of the Bad, and the other is at the mouth of the Bad River. So I spent time there. Then I would reverse course and go up the Brule River from Lake Superior. I hadn't figured out exactly the logistics of how I was going to get up the Brule, because you can't take a motor. There are too many rapids anyway. But once I got up all the way up the Brule, I knew that there was a historic portage trail, only 2 miles long, that leads into the St. Croix. And in a sense, the Portage Trail connects the Great Lakes with the Mississippi and the Gulf of Mexico. So I would cross the Portage Trail, I'd get on the St. Croix River, and I would take that down back into the Mississippi, then go back up the Chippewa, and I would be home again. So that's my round river. I think a friend of mine said, it doesn't really look like a circle, it looks more like the letter E. And I said, well, you just have to imagine it. So here I am, clean shaven and about 5 years younger. And I'm launching my boat in town about a quarter mile from my home. This was not my canoe. A friend loaned me a 17-foot square stern canoe and an ancient outboard to power it. And here I'm launching it. I went about a mile and quickly sprung a leak in the boat and had to come back and patch it. So that's the romance of used canoes. So I love this picture. To me, this painting by George Caleb Bingham kind of encompasses what I feel about rivers and what I was hoping for. I saw this painting at the old field, I think it was a field museum. There used to be an art museum in downtown, not the Art Institute, but a small museum dedicated to American art. And there I saw this painting, and I liked it so much I bought a big poster of it. And Caleb Bingham painted this in 1848, which is actually the year Wisconsin became a state. And it's the Mississippi, the lower Mississippi River. But in many ways, it doesn't look not far removed from the Chippewa River. And I just love the expression on the crew's faces. They just seem to be having a whale of a time. And you're trying to think, well, what makes the jolly flatboatman so jolly? Well, there's a jug of whiskey, I think, on the coach roof. And there's two guys playing musical instruments, and one guy's dancing. But I think it's just a sense of freedom and possibility on a river, and that's what I wanted to. That's what I wanted to duplicate. This, to me, is such an optimistic view of the country. So this is on the Chippewa River. I've only gone about 20 miles, and I set up camp. I love the fact that there is a lot of public land that rivers flow through. And for the most part, if you camp on sandbars, you have, they're free, So rivers were not only the first highways, in some ways they're the first form of public transportation. If you had a boat, they didn't cost you anything. And you could go from one place to another. This is the only place I went fishing. I did catch a catfish and had it for breakfast. It's very good. Now I've entered the Mississippi River, and the Mississippi River is, to me, a fascinating, at least the upper Mississippi, fascinating river. And in some ways, if you're a canoeist, you avoid it. And one of the reasons you avoid it, because the traffic can be horrendous. I mean, big power yachts. But if you are lucky enough to avoid cities with marinas, you can have long stretches of river just like this that remind you of, like the Upper Hudson or the Rhine River. And even though there are highways and railroads on either side, if you're traveling down the Mississippi by boat, you don't see them. And the other thing I like about the Mississippi is that it's still a working river. When I went down the Yukon some years ago, I like the fact that it was a working river as well. In other words, it's great to get away on a wilderness river and not see anybody for a while. But I love to be almost as much on a working river where people live on the river and they work on the river. And it is a really important part of their lives. And the Mississippi is exactly that. To travel up and down the Mississippi, you go through locks and dams, and there are 29 of them on the upper Mississippi River. And the first one for me down from the Chippewa is this lock and dam in Alma. And I spent a couple of days in Alma. And what's fascinating to me is the lock and dams allow for commercial traffic. Before the lock and dams were built in the, prior to the Great Depression, there was almost no commercial barge traffic on the Mississippi anymore. Railroads had sort of taken away the effectiveness of the river for commerce. And the lock and dam system that was built as a public works project in the 30s kind of rejuvenated the whole stretch of upper Mississippi River and kept the towns going. Here you can see there are, I think there are like 4 barges parked in the lock chamber. And then there's me. So a canoeist has every right to go through the lock and dam. So when the barges got through, I was able to enter the lock chamber, and the lockmaster would displace 11 million gallons of water so that I could step down the river. And I asked the guy, do you get many canoeists? So he said, yeah, we get, every summer there's people going. And he asked me how far I was going. And I said, well, I'm going all the way to Prairie du Chien. He said, well, most of the people we get, they're going all the way to Louisiana. And he said, as a matter of fact, there's a guy, an ex-Navy SEAL, and he's swimming the river this summer, which made me feel like renaming my boat the SS Cream Puff. So I liked going, once I got through the initial fear of entering into this space, it was sort of enjoyable going through the locks and dams. This is the Blackhawk Bridge, kind of a neat cantilevered span near Lansing, Iowa. And another thing I liked about the Mississippi is, if you got hungry, you can just tie up. I'm tied up at a place called Shep's Riverside Bar and Grill to have lunch. And when I was in Alma, I would, tie up and I'd stay, stay at a hotel or camp. And again, it just made me feel like I'm part of the flow of things. So that's Lansing, Iowa. When I got to Prairie du Chien, I was there for the beginning of the Prairie Villa Rendezvous, which is, I think, the biggest reenactment of fur trapping days in the upper Mississippi. And what's interesting when you read the history of the area in Prairie du Chien, in fact, this is where rendezvous were held in the late 18th century and early 19th century. So this is another example of things that went around, coming around again. One of the fellows I met at the Prairie Rendezvous was this fellow, Butch Smith. And Butch Smith actually grew up on this island. It's called St. Pharaoh Island. There used to be a whole community. There was a neighborhood, rows of streets and blocks of houses. And he said, I was a boy here. I grew up. My uncle lived over there. My grandmother lived over there. And then I think it was in the late 70s, early 80s, because of the periodic flooding of the island, the Corps of Engineers moved that entire community. So there's nothing there now except this big kind of park-like space where things like the Prairie Rendezvous take place. I thought it was also interesting about Butch Smith, who went by the during the rendezvous, it goes by the name of Bugling Elk. And I said, where'd you get that name? And he said, well, I used to drink a lot and I get real loud. And so they called me Bugling Elk. His specialty is beadwork. And for a guy, you know, with great big hands, he would do the most beautiful decorative beads. Most of these are based on specific tribal designs. And the tribes used to use beadwork decorations, not only as ornamentation, but as a mnemonic device, as a way of remembering things by, you know, whatever they would sew, patterns they sewed into the beadwork. And one of the things that Butch showed me was a belt that had the colors of the South Vietnamese flag. Butch had served in the military and was wounded in Vietnam, and I think he was just carrying on that tradition of beadwork as a way of remembering. Now I've headed up the Wisconsin River. I took another left turn about 3 miles south of Prairie du Chien. And the Wisconsin River is it's very beautiful. Has lots of sandbars. In fact, when Pere Marquette came down the Wisconsin River on his way to discovering, at least for Europeans, the Mississippi, that's one of the things he remarked about. He said the river is full of sandbars and shoals, and they're perfect places to camp for the night. So I'm camped on a sandbar just downriver from the town of Boscobel. And I was intrigued by this dead tree, which is at the high point of the sandbar. You can see the sand's a little damp around the edges. And, you know, I thought during the daytime, the tree looked like a cactus, but at night, as it got dark, I started thinking it looks like Edvard Munch's The Scream, kind of a scary tree trunk. One of the things that surprised me going up to Wisconsin were the pelicans. These are American white pelicans, and they're in a feeding group that's called a scoop, because that's how they feed. They get together and they'll scoop. It's also a kind of defensive position. When by grouping together, they look much larger. When I saw them off in the distance, I thought I was looking at a big white raft. And as I got closer, then I saw the orange bills. They're a really odd looking bird. But when you see them in flight, so when I was going down the Mississippi, and I didn't recognize at the time what I was seeing, but I could see this formation of very large birds flying over the river. This was near Trempealeau. And they looked bigger than geese, and they flew kind of slower than geese. Almost their wings were like they were rowing across the sky. And I had stopped at a hotel in Trempealeau, the Trempealeau Hotel, and I mentioned it to the guy, and he said, those are pelicans. And that's how they fly. They're just very graceful, very beautiful. And as you can see, sitting in my canoe, I'm about eye level with these guys. This is a movie theater in Muscadet. And, you know, a shuttered movie theater is a bad sign in a town. It means one more business is dead. And so when I was walking into Muscadet from the river, I saw the marquee and I thought, oh, good, their theater's still going. And look, there's a double feature. And I got closer and realized it's people who owe for back rent. So apparently, if you want to get your name in lights in Muscadet, you don't pay the rent. This is out of sequence because you can tell it's no longer summer, it's fall. So I took this picture actually some time before I did the trip. This is Aldo Leopold's shack. And it's just north, it's between Wisconsin Dells and Portage. And I always wanted to visit the shack, and I wanted to get there by river. So the shack is just a stone's throw from the Wisconsin River. And you know how things are sometimes smaller when you see them in person than when you read about them. I read Sand County Almanac, which is in many ways a chronicle of Leopold and his family building and staying at the shack. When I was a graduate student in Fairbanks, Alaska, and so I had envisioned it, but this place is even smaller than I had envisioned. It's actually a renovated chicken coop, and I was lucky enough to be allowed inside the shack. It's very, very clean. All the walls are whitewashed, but they would, the whole family would just crowd in there on weekends. And so many of Leopold's ideas originate from his time here, just observing animals change of seasons and making a record of them. And his observations were so detailed, so accurate, that they're used today as a way of kind of judging the effect of climate change in Wisconsin, because there's a record that goes back all the way to the 30s, a kind of constant record. So this was, in a way, my pilgrimage to a place that had been very important to me. Now I'm on the Fox River. Fox River outside of Portage. So there was about a 2-mile portage from the Fox to the Wisconsin. And again, the Winnebago tribe had used that and going back and forth. And for a while, they would charge settlers to use it. And eventually the settlers displaced them. The Upper Fox is very clear, and as you can see here, kind of a beautiful little river, but it also has a lot of seaweed, and the seaweed tangled around the prop of my outboard and would cause the outboard to stall out. This happened a couple of times, and I would tilt the outboard up, cut away the seaweed, and then get going again. Eventually, the outboard wouldn't start, and I realized what had happened was that I had fouled the spark plug, and I went to look for my spark plug wrench, and I had brought the wrong one. It didn't fit, so I couldn't fix the outboard, at least until I got to the next town. So now I am paddling a very heavy canoe with a 50-pound outboard behind it. This is where I set up camp on the Fox. There's not a lot of public land compared to the Chippewa and the Mississippi and most of the rivers that I was on. But there was a state wildlife area that had a high bank, so I set up my camp. I was only about a half a mile from John Muir's boyhood home. So John Muir grew up very close to the Fox River, and I'm sure he spent a lot of time there. I carried with me a marine radio, so I could, if I had to, I could talk to lock and dam operators, but also I could monitor the weather, so I knew what was coming the next day. And I knew a storm was coming. And I made probably the wrong decision, which was to break camp and see if I could beat the storm. Always a bad idea. So I get out on the Fox, it widens into a lake, and then this full-fledged electrical storm hits. And I'm, in the pouring rain and lightning all over, and I'm sitting maybe the highest thing around in a metal boat. And I needed to get off the river, but I didn't know where. And then I saw a light in a cottage, and all the other cottages were dark because it wasn't the weekend. And I ran into this guy, Nick, who was a unemployed mechanic. And I'm coming to his back door in the pouring rain very early in the morning, and with no car, and he must have wondered where I came from. But I knocked, and he was very gracious, and I said, would you have a spark plug wrench? And he said, yeah, somewhere in my shed. And there's Nick's shed. So we went, somehow he found the right wrench. What I found on the trip was that people were more than willing to help. There's something about when you travel alone, people are more likely to take you in. So Nick brought me into the house, met his wife, had coffee, watched a game show until the rain passed, and then we went out and fixed the spark plug. And he said, why don't you keep the spark plug wrench? And I said, well, aren't you going to need it? He said, no, don't worry about it. And then he said, and I'm quoting, might come in handy down the road. Don't worry about me. God looks out for me as he looks out for you. I believe that everything comes around. And I thought, well, that's perfect because I'm on the Round River. So. Another instance in which people took me in is on Lake Puckaway. So the Fox River widened into a lake, and I got caught in a big wind, and I'm trying to get down the lake, but the waves are coming perpendicular to the canoe, and I'm worried I'll turn over. So what I have to do is just follow the waves. I have to align myself and go in whatever direction the waves are going. And they were going to this tavern. This is a place called the Good Old Days Tavern. And I said, I don't want to go out in the boat tonight. Can I set up my tent? He said, yeah, go ahead, set it up by the horseshoe pits. So I did, and I had, I thought the traveler's perfecta. I had a place to stay, a place where I could buy a nice roasted chicken and cheap beer. One of the things that interested me was, the divisions that we, bartender had lived in Florida, and he's talking about how he had to come back to Wisconsin because he couldn't get a job because he didn't speak Spanish. And you want to tell people that immigration comes in waves, and you only see the wave that's coming. You don't remember the wave you came in on, your parents came in on, your grandparents came in. There are Spanish-speaking neighborhoods in Milwaukee. I know because my daughter worked in one. And before they were Spanish-speaking, they were Polish-speaking. And before that, they were German-speaking. At any rate, I was grateful to have a place to stay. This is a guy named Sam, and he's shore fishing for catfish, and he's holding up. He had a whole cooler full of catfish, holding up a flathead cat, and told me the best way to get him was to use stink bait. I asked him what kind of stink bait he used. And he said, Sammy's super stinky stinkfish bait, something like that. And he would dab it on and then fish below a dam on the Fox. Okay, now we're making an enormous leap in terms of geography. We're on the beach at Lake Superior, on the Bad River Indian Reservation. And the guy who's holding the stick is Mike Wiggins, Jr., who just got reelected as tribal chair. And what he's doing is drawing a map of the Bad River to show me. And at the top of his drawing, that bump is the Pinocchio Hills. And that's the kind of the headwaters. And at the bottom, a little serrated line is Lake Superior. And the axis, the line running between them is the Bad River. And he's explaining why he had opposed a company digging a enormous open pit iron mine in the Pinocchios, just a couple miles from the reservation, because it was close to the headwaters of the river, and any toxic chemicals leaching out from the tailings could have come down the river and poison the wild rice that's at the mouth. And I like this picture, and because it reminded me of a much older picture from 1849. So this was also from the Lake Superior Chippewa. This is the symbolic petition drawn on birchbark that was carried by Chief Ashkawa Biwas. And it is also a map of the south shore of Lake Superior and the little lakes. And the figures of what appear to be animals are icons that represent the principal clans of the Lake Superior Chippewa. And there are lines that are drawn from each animal to the other, and from the mind and from the heart. And the lines signify that the clans are in agreement in mind and spirit in opposing any attempts by the government in 1849 to push the Chippewa off their land. This document was carried by canoe by the chief and several warriors in 3 canoes. They made an epic journey to the White House from Lake Superior, and in a sense followed some of the route that I'm following, which is they went up the Brule, across the Portage, down the St. Croix, down into the Mississippi. Then they took a steamboat up the Ohio. Then they got on a train and they went to petition President Zachary Taylor not to remove them from their homeland. He seemed to agree and then later seemed to change his mind. But it reminded me of something that Mike Wiggins had told me. He said, you know, whether we're removed from the land or the water and land is removed from us, it's all the same thing. If they don't remove us from the land, but they take away the quality of the water and to destroy the wild rice beds, it has the same effect. These are the wild rice beds. This is Edith Leozo, who is the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer, and this is Cagogan Slough. And between Cagogan Slough to the east and the mouth of the Bad River to the west is 16,000 acres of wetlands. It's one of the largest freshwater estuaries in the world. This is why the Bad River Chippewa opposed the open pit iron mine. They were worried about the wild rice beds. Why did the Chippewa settle where they did? It's the rice beds. So when I found out that Edith was leading a group of teachers to see Cagogan Slough, I begged a ride. And the slough, as it nears Lake Superior, becomes very kind of sinuous and travels round and round. And there were several cutoff sloughs, and I remember asking her about one slough that seemed to, come in and then reappear later. And she said, "Oh, we call that the Round River." I thought, perfect, that's great. Now, here's a stupid thing to do: stand up in a canoe and then try to pole your way up the Brule River. So that's what I'm going to attempt to do. I'm in Lake Superior and I'm about to go up the mouth. I couldn't do it. I couldn't pole, and then I found out I couldn't paddle. And in the end, I've just got a line on the bow, and I'm just walking up the river and hauling the canoe behind me. You notice I've switched out the square stern aluminum canoe for a smaller fiberglass canoe. I got 10 miles up the river and called it a day. So when I came to a highway bridge, I hailed a canoe shuttle. Luckily, there was a canoe shuttle. And I asked them to take me to the end of the river, well, where most people begin their canoe trips. And so then I went upriver from there, paddling, and I followed the Brule until it was this big. And then pretty soon it just disappeared. So this is literally the headwaters. And I can't go any further. And I'm looking for the historic 2-mile Portage Trail, and I can't find it, and a storm is coming on. So I just pulled the canoe out of the water and headed up to a high ridge and got in the lee of the storm, set up my tent. And the next day I get up and I go behind the tent to relieve myself, and there's the Portage Trail, which I didn't see the day before. So this is the trail. And European explorers had used this very trail in order to explore into the Mississippi. And before that, the Chippewa and other tribes had used this very trail. So it was 2 miles. of lugging my gear and my canoe. And I reached the headwaters of the St. Croix River. And I'm in a wild rice bed at this point. And there's just a pathway through the rice. The St. Croix is the only river I went down. I traveled the whole length of it, 165 miles. And it's sort of a fascinating river. It's also, a wild and scenic, designated wild and scenic river. It's fascinating in that it begins in wilderness and it ends like this in metropolitan Twin Cities. And I've come to a spot called Swing Bridge Island. You can see the swing bridge in the background. And you can see my canoe pulled up on shore, dwarfed by these power yachts. And the only danger I had in this whole trip was trying to avoid these enormous boats that would throw, 2-3 foot wake. And if you're in a little canoe with about 10 inches of freeboard, a 2.5 foot wake can, swamp you. But anyway, once I got on land with these guys, they were, the most charming people in the world. Here, come on, have something to eat, have a drink, have another drink. So I joined their camp, and they went off to visit, I think, Hudson. When they came back, everybody was sort of inebriated. They had a power sound system aboard, and the song playing was Neil Diamond's Sweet Caroline, and all the women in the party would fist bump the air when the song went about the good times being so good, so good, so good. And the woman who was married to the guy who owns this boat, Bada Bing, said, one thing about boat people is we really like to drink. Now I'm on the last leg of the trip. I'm back on the Mississippi. This is the widest part of the whole Mississippi River. It's Lake Pepin. It's 21 miles long, 2 miles wide. And my one concern, other than getting run over by a big power yacht, was to get caught in a windstorm on Lake Pepin. So I camped on the shore and got up real early in the morning when I knew the wind would be calm, and I'm heading down Lake Pepin. And I want to, at this point, I want to get home. What I didn't realize is that the Chippewa in my absence had fallen extremely low. And I'm back, I can't run the motor anymore. And I'm back lining the boat up the river. Took the wrong turn, and eventually I just decided to quit and call for a ride. So to end, this is my last camp. I'm south of Durand. It was foggy morning, and what I love about being on a river in a fog is like sometimes you feel like you're the only person on earth. So anyway, that's the trip. So any questions?
Thank you, John. Yes, we have a few questions. Steve, do you want to take the first one?
Okay. Let's see. I got to put my chat on. The chat is not coming up. Oh, do you sense that Wisconsin has lost or maintained the environmental ethos that Aldo, Leopold, John Muir, and Gaylord Nelson made famous?
Well, it depends what administration is in Madison. When I made the trip, Scott Walker was governor, I made the trip in 2015. He was terrible, I thought, for the environment. He's the one who got behind the open pit iron mine up in the Pinocchis. Here's the problem, is that the rural areas are economically hurting. Little towns like Mellon and other towns up there. But that mining project would have resulted in fairly few jobs because of the kind of equipment that they're using, and they would have jeopardized kind of long-term assets like the river quality and the wild rice. It bothered me that the person that Walker had appointed as head of the Department of Natural Resources was a developer. That sort of shows where his interests were. So I think Tony Evers is doing the best he can. The idea of the Department of Natural Resources is to protect, our rivers and our lakes and the forests for everybody and for perpetuity, not to turn a quick buck. So, yeah, I hope so. I mean, one of the things that struck me was that few exceptions, other than the Brule and the Wisconsin, I didn't see many people on the rivers canoeing. One night I stayed at a huge, it was called a campground, but it was really an RV park by Spring Green. And, what worries me is we don't use our rivers and forests. We're not going to care about them. We're not. There won't be a constituency for them. I hope the next generation is as interested in what we have available for natural resources as previous ones, but I don't know.
Well, here's another one then. With anyone, why?
Are you
What
there? Are you
insights
there?
do you have from these conversations as to the political state of Wisconsin?
I think people, I mean, the people in the small towns that I met were good to me. They seemed friendly. I think that the political divide. So, I thought Wisconsin was the most divided state in the nation, and then we had the national election. So I think it's a national problem. I think there's a lot of resentment that's basically economic. Most of the economic growth in the country since the last Great Recession has been in metropolitan areas and in mid-sized cities like Madison, and almost none in smaller towns. It's pretty hard to avoid when you're traveling around. You go from one small town to another. Only a few of them seem to be in good shape, which is to say, self-sustaining. So I think that resentment gets played out in our, political choices. I would like to see more.
Put him out, please.
More of the pie divided geographically. So, we did that in the Great Depression with the Civilian Conservation Corps. They made real improvements in rural areas. Not only that, they brought new blood into rural areas. You know, they brought new people, mainly people from cities. It just amazes me that how depopulated the countryside is getting. And that's not a good thing. So I don't know if that answers you. I think people, you know, will vote for anybody who says, I'm going to take care of you economically.
Okay.
Thank you. I have one from Chuck. What were the dates of your trip? How many days were you on the river and gone? And weren't you worried about the river flooding when you were camped on the sandbars?
So I was gone 5 weeks. I took a break in the middle because my wife told me to. And so, you know, I was traveling in June and I was traveling in August. And I didn't worry much about getting flooded off a sandbar, mainly because I was able to monitor what the weather was going to be. When I traveled down the Yukon, I really worried about that because you could have a storm, you know, 1,000 miles upriver that you wouldn't know anything about. But I did monitor, and you always want to, to find higher ground. But I didn't find that to be a problem.
These are my questions now. Did you deal with any predators when you were camping in these wild areas?
Just the guys in the big yachts. They were, I chased a guy down in a speedboat who just about flipped me over. I followed him back to the dock and I said, hey, you just about capsized me out there. And the guy said, hey man, sorry, I didn't see you. And I said, well, that's the point I'm making. You didn't see me. And the guy, his breath just stank of booze. I mean, that's what you deal with if you're in an area that gets a lot of, heavy speedboat traffic.
And this is from a wilderness camper. What did you do about water? Were you able to carry enough water?
Yeah, so I mean, I carried 5 gallons of water with me, and then I was always stopping at towns. So it's not like a Quetico trip, where I'm purifying water all the time. It was nice, to go into a cafe and get something to eat, and also listen to people or stop in a bar, or so it was not about wilderness travel. I did hear a lot of coyotes. I heard bear hunters pursuing a bear. When I was sleeping in my tent, I could hear the dogs going after the bear, and I was hoping the bear would not, tear through my tent. But I never had any problem.
I think we have one final question. This is also from Chuck, who is currently reading your book. And he says it appears that you found very little diversity in the people that you met along the way. And he wonders what impact you feel that has on the attitudes of the river folks.
Well, I don't know. It depends on how you define diversity. I mean, if you're talking about racial diversity, I didn't see many Black people. I saw one Black family on the Wisconsin And I guess I noticed that, you know, the guy who almost ran me down with a speedboat was a Hmong guy, which surprised me. What struck me was a lot of the people that were especially nice to me were out of work or on disability. I think the biggest divide, and I'm saying this from somebody who just came back from staying in a very crowded section of Philadelphia where there's all the diversity in the world. I mean, I was working with my son-in-law, and you know, you're hearing Spanish, you're hearing Russian, you know, it's a real melting pot. But one of the big divides in this country is between rural and urban. You know, and I think that's what's hurt our politics. You know, I think that people are dividing themselves into camps, and you know, it's so different from that painting I showed. You know, the jolly flat boatman. The faces, those faces are all optimistic. You know, can't wait to see what's around the bend. And you know, if you're in a town where, you know, all the businesses are closing and you're a long way from a hospital, and as one person pointed out to me, you know, our greatest export are our children.
Yeah.
There's going to be, there's a price for that.
Yeah.
Well, John, we at Woods and Wetlands want to thank you so much for sharing tonight. And we do have one announcement. I don't know if Thomas got my email, but we will not see you next month in December because we'll all be so busy with the festivities of the season. But in January, we are very pleased to have a Native American, Joseph Podlassek, who will be, he's actually a Chippewa from his tribe is actually in northern Wisconsin, and he's going to tell us about the Native Americans' view of the land. And it talk about a round river. This will go back to an earlier talk we had at one of our very first speaker series meetings when we had a fellow speak to us about Aldo Leopold, who was the father of the modern land ethic. And I think Thomas has a few words.
Yes, thank you so much for joining us on another Woods and Wetlands speakers meeting. John, your presentation was absolutely outstanding. Linda and Steve, thank you so much for handling the questions. Just one last note: to become a member of the Sierra Club, and if you live in Lake County, Illinois, or a few suburbs in Cook and McHenry counties of the Woods and Wetlands group, just go to sierraclub.org and click on the join button over to the right on the home page. Your zip code will automatically assign you to Woods and Wetlands, or if you live elsewhere, to another local group. And finally, as soon as this doggone pandemic is behind us, we will resume a robust schedule of hiking, bicycling, and paddling activities. And of course, we ask you to keep in mind that the Sierra Club is always working on your behalf to promote a clean and safe environment. John, thank you once again for a very interesting presentation. And to everyone who's listening tonight, we hope you get involved, and we will see you again in January. I think that's January 9th, is it not,
January
Linda?
9th, yes. And
At
special
7 p.m. So.
One last
special
thing,
thanks to Anne, who is a former student who has been giving us a guidance along through your talk.
thank you. And the last thing I'd like to do is invite you to try paddling some of Wisconsin rivers. We've got a lot of them, and hope to see you on the water.
Excellent. We will do that. Thank you, everyone, and good night.
Good night.
Good night.